Welcome, everyone. My name is Casey Mukai, and on behalf of YBE, I would like to thank you all for joining us for the Young Buddhist Editorial second event in our summer event series, Face to Face, Abolition and Buddhism. To begin, we would first like to acknowledge that the land we are on, if you are currently in the US, is stolen land due to the forced removal of First Nations and Indigenous peoples. We want to be sure that we frame our conversation today with this in mind, as it is important that we understand this history that has come to bring us here today and occupy this land, and also seek to understand our place within that history. And although we are spread out across the US, we encourage you to go to this link to acknowledge what land you are currently on. Also, we would like to just send out these community agreements that I'll send to the chat right now. We just wanted to create a space where everyone feels safe to learn and also be in community with each other. However, we welcome any other recommendations that y'all have for community agreements that would also make you feel welcome in this space. So feel free to also send those to the chat if you would like. We really want for us to, really be in community. So feel free to use the chat box or ask questions, as well as the reactions on Zoom if something really resonates with you. This is just a reminder that the speaker and the panelist portions of our event are going to be recorded. However, our breakout room discussions will not be. And one of the most important things that we want to reiterate is just to be respectful of others. For those of you that are new with us here today, I would just like to give a brief intro to what YBE is. The Young Buddhist Editorial was started in January of 2020 by a group of young Japanese American Jodo Shinshu Buddhists while at a youth minister's assistance retreat at Seattle Buddhist Temple. We were started with the intention of creating a space and platform for young Buddhists to foster growth, community, and interconnectedness while creating a dialogue between young Buddhists and other generations of Buddhists. The Social Justice Committee of YBE was started last summer in response to the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, where we hosted a series of workshops on how we can approach and talk about race in our community. However, from there, the Social Justice Committee has grown to be so much more. We have held several other workshops, we have released statements and community building and just so much more. And we would also just like to open this space for anyone who would like to get more involved in our work. Feel free to contact us or the YBE in general if you would like to write something or get more involved with YBE. In the chat, I'm also just going to send a brief skeleton of our schedule for today. We'll be starting with a guided meditation, followed by our panel, and then breakout room discussion and conclusion. And with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing JP de Guzman. JP, among other accomplishments, holds his PhD in history from UCLA, where he currently teaches as a part of the Asian American Studies Department. His areas of expertise particularly focus on comparative racialization, urban history, Asian Americans in Los Angeles. We are so honored to also have JP as a very dear member of the Social Justice Committee, who will be facilitating our panelist discussion today. And so without further ado, I'll pass it over to JP.
Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you all for being here and joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome to our virtual stage our two speakers for today. First, we have Eli Ryn Brown. Eli uses they, he pronouns, and Eli is a Chicago-based Black, queer, and non-binary meditation instructor. They have been meditating in both the Zen and Zanshin styles for 15 years. Currently, he leads meditation for the Midwest Buddhist Temple, various community groups and martial arts groups, as well as providing free and sliding scale one-on-one sessions. As they study to become a Buddhist minister, they use their martial arts and meditation experience to bring accessible community healing options to marginalized groups and people in need, especially queer and trans people of color. His practice is grounded in meditation as an act of abolition, and he sees this communal healing as part of the radical rest that helps sustain revolutionary action. Joining Eli is Traci Ishigo, who uses they and she pronouns. Traci Ishigo, MSW, is a queer, non-binary, Japanese-American Buddhist therapist, community organizer, and trauma-informed yoga and meditation teacher. They are based in the San Fernando Valley of the greater LA area, the unceded lands of the Fernandino Tataviam people. Traci is the co-founder and co-director of Vigilant Love, a healing justice grassroots organization that works to protect the safety and justice of communities impacted by Islamophobia and white supremacist violence through their creative solidarity, programs, and abolitionist campaign, #services, not surveillance. In their private practice called Webs of Wellbeing, Traci provides individuals and couples psychotherapy and politicized healing-centered consulting with community-based organizations informed by their experiences. Traci is honored to build with survivors, creatives, and activists to cultivate collective healing. They proudly belong to the San Fernando Valley Honganji Buddhist Temple, their son. We are so honored and so grateful to welcome these healers, these teachers, these activists in our space to help us identify and think through what the connections between. Also joining us will be Joanne Ho, a social justice, who will be doing the labor of behind the scenes monitoring what our may be like. What I want to do now is hand it over, particularly who will lead us in a guided meditation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, JP, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks, everybody, for being here, YBE and Traci, and all the folks who are joining in. I wanted to start off with a little meditation for us to just kind of ground into our bodies, tap into what's on, what we're feeling and how we're showing up to this space, so we can just kind of meet ourselves as authentically as possible and carry that kind of open calmness into our discussion. So if everybody will take a comfortable position, perhaps you'll be sitting just up where you are. You could lay down if you'd like to. I'll give you a couple seconds to get comfortable. And I'm going to go ahead and ring my bell a couple times, and then I'll guide us through just a couple clearing breaths, and we'll do kind of a short abridged body scan. So we'll just tap into our body, kind of feel what we're feeling, and hopefully get some calm. Take a deep breath in through your nose and slowly let it out through your mouth. Take a second to join yourself exactly right now, exactly where you sit. Feel the weight of your clothes against you. Perhaps it's warm around you or cold. Maybe a breeze or still air. Continue to gently breathe in and out as you direct your attention into the soles of your feet. Notice the sensations against them. Perhaps take a moment to gently wiggle your toes or stretch your ankles. And then let your feet return to stillness, inviting some rest into your body. Bring your awareness up into your shins and calves, gently releasing any tension that might be there today. Let the tops of your shins feel light, reaching out towards the air. And let the backs of your calves become relaxed and heavy. Notice the sensations in the knees, any stiffness or tension, any calm or ease. Simply taking a moment to check in with your body and how it feels today. Noting that pain can be an indicator of where we might direct our care. Bring your awareness up into the thighs, releasing the inner thighs if they have clenched at all. Notice the sensations in the hips and glutes, letting the base of your spine root down into your pelvis. Let your lower half become an anchor, slowly sinking into your spot, gently holding you up. Bring your awareness into the belly and lower back. On your next inhale, let the skin on your stomach stretch and let yourself take up space, becoming full. On the exhales, feel your belly button float gently towards your spine and find a gentle release in the breath slowly leaving your body. Bring your awareness up into your chest, upper back. Let your shoulders melt away from the ears. Perhaps you roll your shoulders back or forwards, gently feeling your body. Take a deep breath in through the nose, and this time slowly let it out through your mouth. Noticing your whole body in your spot. Knowing that all we have to do right now is inhale and exhale. Nothing more and nothing less. We are exactly where we need to be. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. Also, I recommend.
Thank you so much for that, Ryn. I feel so grateful for the opportunity to experience the ways in which you and help us all feel so much more grounded and rooted in our bodies so we could better access our minds and our hearts as well. So friends, before we start, I want to discuss a very quick logistical thing. So for many of us, abolition is a new concept. For us, it might practice that we've been doing all along without abolition. So we really aspire to have this to be a space of curiosity, a space where we could think through our practice in many different ways. And we really encourage you to make use of the chat and to make use of a platform called Jamboard, which many of you might be familiar with. I'll ask the tech folks if they could put that in the chat right now. But Jamboard is a digital space that allows you to post thoughts and questions and things like that. So what I'm going to do very briefly is to model this for us by sharing my screen. So you'll see that there is this panel here. You can, with your cursor, click on a sticky note, which will look like that. Spot. And you can use these tools as a way to post your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, things that stick with you, things that you would like to recall later in our discussion. You'll see I moved my cursor up to this little arrow here that says next frame. And we invite you to follow along because, again, part of our practice today is realizing we're all in different places and we all have different ways to imagine something different based on our causes and conditions. So I want us all now to pause and process even before we dive in, to think about what brought you to this space. Again, I invite you to add to the chat your response to this question, or for us to see it all in one place, grab a sticky note and add your response to this question. What brought you to this space? What would you like to leave with? We want to learn. We want to learn and grow with our communities. How wonderful we've made it right here. I see the theme of community is appearing here. Perfect. So let's just, because we all had a very busy, maybe we had work, maybe we had school, maybe we had family to take care of. Let's take a moment to really understand the community we're with. Joanne, is there anything you would like to add?
I'm just taking in all of these wonderful comments. I certainly have a lot of questions about abolition myself, and I feel very at home that that everyone here wants to learn more about this with me.
Indeed, I think that curiosity is so meaningful, and as we will learn, curiosity is so powerful. So what I want to do now is bring it back to our speakers themselves and pose a disarmingly simple question, which is, of course, very complex. And this first question for our speakers, which taps into a lot of the things we saw on the Jamboard, is how did you come to be an abolitionist? Or how do you define abolitionism for yourself?
Wondering who wants to begin. Is that for me? Well, you led us through such a great meditation that I could get us started, but I'm really glad to be here with everybody. I want to say hello to my friends who joined, but also just to be in conversation with you, Ryn, and to have JP as our moderator. Just been looking forward to this conversation. And let's see, I feel like every day it feels like there's more reasons to become an abolitionist or to identify with abolition. And I think even just being in this pandemic right now, I've been reflecting on that more, like what a privilege it is to be able to be, like sheltering in place at home, and what it means for a lot of people who are impacted by the prison system, if we're thinking about prison abolition in particular. But I think that for me, maybe I'll start off with this question, JP, about how I came to become an abolitionist and root it back in my experience of growing up in the temple and growing up in the Shin Buddhist community. Because I think that growing up, I heard a lot of messages about like something that we often recite is the golden chain. And in that, there's a lot of messages about, how we are all a part of this golden chain of love that stretches around the world. So it's already orienting me to be thinking about like our deep interconnectedness. And it's not only about my happiness or unhappiness, but it's also that of all others. And with that, I think that I wasn't thinking very much about, I think maybe growing up in the 90s, like being a child of the 90s too, it was like a time of color blindness. It felt really difficult for me growing up to even like think about race. I felt like I felt it. I could see the segregation even in my own high school, but it wasn't a language that I feel like we have now today. But it wasn't until college. And I started undergrad in 2009. So like where our economy was after the 2008 crash. What we saw at that time was a 32% tuition increase that was levied on students. And that whole experience began to really politicize me because what I was seeing was like big inequities in terms of who could afford education anymore, and just how it was impacting undocumented students, low-income students. And just seeing like these charts that would reflect like, this is what the divestment from higher education looks like versus what the investment has looked like in California's prison system has looked like over the years. And thinking about like where we are today, like the massive overcrowding that we see in California prisons has just been really intense. And so during that time, I feel like reflecting a lot more about these issues, going to like students of color conferences, learning about Angela Davis, getting to hear her speak, really beginning to hear from more organizers about the prison industrial complex. And I think for the first time, really like reflecting more upon my own identities as a Japanese American or as a queer person. I think a lot of different parts of who I am. And in that, during that time when, I think I grew up in a pretty privileged upbringing of like not coming from a community that was over policed, or having a lot of police interactions. But in that experience, like really, I think reflecting also about, for one of the first times for me, about my own community's history as Japanese Americans of being incarcerated during World War II. And I think in reflecting on just all of the ways that, like how it came to be politically possible, ethically and morally possible for my own community to be incarcerated during World War II was this like construction of like, who are we as a people? Are we the enemy? Are we national security threats? Who were my elders or my ancestors or family members perceived to be during that time? And there's so many correlations with that in terms of who we see as being impacted by carceral tools of punishment today. And so I think when I think about abolition, going back to the second question, JP, I feel like for me, I'm thinking about a lot of carceral tools of punishment. So it's about, seeking to dismantle or be critical and work to defund a lot of these tools of policing or surveillance of prisons. But it's also, I think, expanding into who else is impacted by the construction of like how we view each other, for not like seeing ourselves as like who we really are. In my work at Vigilant Love, we work to organize against Islamophobia, and it's so clear how Muslims or folks who are perceived Muslims are perceived as terrorists. And what we've seen, it's almost 20 years since 9/11, and what we've seen in the war on terror and the impact that it's had on people who, whether it be what we see in Guantanamo Bay and or just a lot of infiltration that's happened at mosques and masjids. And I think for the work that we're doing here locally, we're seeing an expansion of surveillance or community policing into a lot of, even mental health spaces. So I feel like there's a lot over there, but it's not just about the dismantling of that, but it's also about the healing aspect too. Or it's about like, what are we looking to rebuild? And I think in my own process of politicization and learning about what abolition is, and I very much feel like a student always, and so not claiming to be an expert, even though I'm getting the honor to share here. But I think for me, what feels really energizing about the topic of abolition is about like what we get to create. If we recognize and see how much suffering is caused by over-policing, and we get to hear the stories of others and be moved by them, be moved by what we saw in terms of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, what do we get to imagine as these other possibilities is such an important part of abolition. It's not just what are we taking away and defunding the police, but it's about really beginning to question for ourselves, like how do we want to, you know, if we're thinking about it from a fiscal level, what do we want to use with our taxpayer dollars, if we're thinking more maybe selfishly on that level, or on a collective level, what we want to see, but like what would truly make us all feel safer? And so much of that, I think, comes through with the way that we relate to each other, or the mutual aid that we've seen during this pandemic, just a lot of the possibilities of the healing services or the community approaches that I think so many organizations that I see locally aren't funded enough. And I think that in the midst of the uprisings last year is really surprising for a lot of people. To see how bloated the budgets were of local police departments everywhere. I know for Los Angeles, it's almost like 50% of the general fund is going to the LAPD. And so I think whether you identify as abolitionist today or not, I think these are questions of like, we all are, I think, wondering about these questions of what does safety mean for ourselves, or what's going to make us feel more secure in our futures. And I think that there are these like public goods around, whether it be like education or healthcare or land, access to green space. There's so much culture, I think, that we need to be preserving too. But like, how does abolition not only mean what are we taking away, but what are we really supporting even further? And I think maybe just for, if I have a bit of time to like add maybe a more personal component here too, in terms of like my reflections around abolition, I feel like this feels really important. That actually guided a lot of my path maybe into therapy work as well, is being a survivor of sexual violence. And I think a lot of people, you know, I think a lot of survivors of different paths may choose to go through the court system for their own reasons, you know, and may choose to seek out the prison system as an option for justice, or what feels like justice. But oftentimes what we also recognize from these systems is like, how much does it really center the survivors, or how much does it really create these deeper experiences of healing that would eradicate rape culture in the first place? Like just from what I've been learning about and understanding is how much, whether it be in the military or whether it be in prisons or the police misconduct themselves, is that this is where rape culture really thrives. And so many people who are incarcerated are actually survivors of whether it be child sexual abuse to just becoming a survivor by being in the system. These are such violent and oppressive institutions. So just thinking, I think, about the suffering that these institutions or these carceral ways of controlling or repressing each other or dividing each other, it does so much to, I think, human dignity or our own feeling of safety or autonomy in our lives. So I think that there's so much that goes into abolition. And I think, yeah, those are just some of maybe of the starting reflections that I have at this time.
Thank you so much for that, Tracy. Um, took pages and pages of notes on what you shared. And I really want to thank you for highlighting the intense ways in which, to think about that old truism that the personal is political, that it is so, enriching when we think about how the circumstances around us, shape so many people other than ourselves. And I think it was so amazing, and many people commented in the chat about how, again, deeply personal, histories and traumas inspire us to dismantle, but also create. And so thank you for that. But I want to give the space to Ryn now to share your thoughts and how you came to this pathway.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for that answer also, Tracy. That was so wonderful to listen to and try to absorb. I think while hearing you, a lot of your talk about safety really resonated with, I think, how I came to be an abolitionist and how I came to even like approach that word at all. I think growing up as like a Black person, I'm from like Orange County area, Santa Ana, but just in like very white environments, often in school, like being othered in that way, being queer and trans, being like a young Black girl basically walking around, like that's a very politicized existence. And so I think from an early age, before I knew the word abolition, that's what I was trying to build in my like seeking of queer community and of trans community. I was trying to find people who were trying to live a way that was more compassionate, that involved like including all of us in like our fullness a little more, and trying to stop like, I don't know, charading about our roles as people as much. That I think that was like my teenagehood, and just having many encounters really early on with police that were just violent from the start, or unpleasant for a variety of reasons, really like politicized me young, I think. And so in growing up with kind of Zen and martial arts and Shin Buddhism as my kind of compass throughout my teen years, a lot of the things I was learning at the dojo or at when I was reading, Buddhist texts or something like that, were talking about dissolving boundaries, dissolving our perceptions of things in between each other, or borders, basically. And so, in thinking, being from Southern California, thinking about borders and all the like immigration policies that have happened in the past 15 years, was easy to start thinking abolition in that way. I think at first for me, of thinking of abolishing borders, thinking of like living a way that was a little bit more expansive on the personal. And then in my like 20s and up to now, I think really living in Chicago and with the CPD here has been an even kind of more intense experience. The interactions have been, I think, more charged than when I was younger, just because of the nature of the police here and where I am. And so in leading meditations and in thinking of how to like exist in a world where there's so much separation and like violence built into the very way we talk to each other and like think about each other, like in showing up to a space as feeling like a liminal body, somebody who's in between gender and race and every kind of category that I was taught when I was younger. Often it felt like, okay, I have to break myself up into pieces to exist. So there was just an initial violence of existing. And in growing into myself more and putting the pieces of me back into one form and trying to embody that, I've grown to see those around me as so much more full human beings, and that involves trying to really like figure out how to care for people. And so for me, abolition, thank you for, my thoughts are a little windy, but abolition comes from that thought of safety, right? I was seeking safety so fervently my whole life, and even still. And so as I've grown to build my own safety and to know people who are organizers and who are teaching me how to live more justly in this world and live more compassionately, I've found that abolition is where I end up every time. Like, no matter what I'm trying to feel, it would be helped by abolition. No matter who I'm trying to help, they would be helped by abolition. Like, that just is where I end up every time. And also on like an ancestral note, it feels kind of like lineage. I think abolition in America, that word is first used for the abolition of slavery, and that movement birthed the police, right? That's where the police come from, trying to like capture runaway slaves and things like that. And so this feels like a continuation of those who have fought before me and who have existed so that I can exist. And I think that so much of being a Black person in America is seeing just a swath of violence wherever you go. If you want to see it, it's there, right? In every institution, whether I'm going to the doctor, whether I'm going to school, academia, just the grocery store, whether I'm being followed in a Sephora by a very well-meaning middle-aged woman, there is no way to turn away. There's no turning off that lens for me. And though I can be complicit in all the ways we can all be complicit, I think that inability to turn that valve off has kind of thrust me into trying to uphold my lineage and make it easier for those who come after me and make it easier for those who are here right now. I think on the note of creating, which Traci put so eloquently, there's so much in world building with your friends, in dreaming of safety and dreaming of fun, sensuality, creativity, like ways your body can be, ways you can touch each other, ways you can see each other and hold space for each other. So much of that has radically opened up every part of my life. And I think the more I come into those spheres of work, of loving, of caring, and community, the more abolition kind of guides me into being a fuller version of myself. And then that just keeps informing fuller versions of the people around me. And so it's kind of this like generative building of like understanding and love, right? The more I understand everybody, the more I can love them. And the more I love them, the more I want to understand them. And that leads to wanting to abolish anything that would hold any of those people back or hurt them. I just think there's so many ways we can be more tender and more anti-oppressive in general. We can undo our thinking in different ways by embracing abolition into our praxis and just life, into our homes and our works. So I think that's kind of my path to abolition these days. And I really feel being an abolitionist today means like trying to keep myself informed of how I am upholding systems of dominance, how I can help dismantle them, and how I can dream of different ways of being. So that's my answer. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ryn. That was so amazing. And the connections I'm, observing between both of your, very, to quote from Marissa pointed out, very vulnerable stories is, desire for and think imaginatively, think experimentally about what that safety can be like. I'm so grateful that you talked about this sense of fullness. And I also want to bring back an observation that, we would weight of history in so many ways. And it is so empowering to think about how both of you have articulated the ways in which we can use that weight of history as a catalyst to truly feel our full selves and empower others to do so. Traci or Ryn, do either of you have any other things you want to share, given we've worries?
Can you repeat that last part, JP? Given I missed it.
Oh yeah, just given that we've had the opportunity to hear both of your stories in conversation, do either of you have any other observations or curiosities that you would like to share?
I do. It's kind of a half-baked thought, Ryn, but in listening to your story, especially, and thank you so much for sharing. But in the part where, and I think someone actually dropped it into the chat about abolish anything that hurts or holds back the people we love. And I felt like I heard you speaking to, like at least the way I was interpreting it and thinking about abolition as well. Like we're thinking about like these institutions, or oftentimes that's what we're discussing, especially coming from an organizer perspective, a community organizing perspective, right? I think whether it be to address the like policing or surveillance systems or whatnot, what I'm hearing from you and your reflections is also, I think about like our discriminating mind. And I guess I'm curious, even as like two people who are queer or, gender nonconforming in different ways, I'm wondering about how like the way that we view each other across a lot of different identities are an important facet of abolition too. How actually like the way that we see what we hold up as ideal, whether it's, you're able-bodied or you're neurotypical or, neurodivergent, or there's so many stigmas too, I think, around if you are a sex worker, that is a bad thing inherently without having a curiosity of like who you really are and your lived experiences. I think that there's like so much complexity that gets oversimplified when we're looking to these institutions that control and police and oppress people, that are actually over targeting trans people oftentimes, or are targeting a lot of people who struggle with addiction or mental health disorders, or mental health issues are often found within jails and prisons as well. I feel like there's so much around citizenship too and our immigration status, but that's some of the reflections that I was thinking about as I was hearing you speak about how difficult it is that there's all these institutions that get in the way of us truly connecting with each other.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those reflections. I think that's so true, and a lot of like the internal work of abolition is like, I find for myself breaking down those like biases, because yes, I'm like Black, queer, and trans, but like I'm still here in this context, and I've been raised with the same media, more or less for everybody in this country at least, and trying to like take these flattened narratives that these oppressive systems give us, because it's the way to kind of monolith everybody, is to flatten everybody's narrative, and then we get these little packages that people are trying to fit into, but that were never meant to really fully represent us. And I think that there's so many different ways that violence can like seep into our thinking in that way. And I feel like that fits in so wonderfully with like the work you do, especially like also being like a communal organizer, and then like doing individual and couple work, like you're attending to people in like full different contexts. And I think so much of trying like that creative part for me, of like, okay, well, if we dismantled stuff, like what would people do and how would we take care of each other? Like learning different ways to have people be able to see and be represented by people like them and be heard by people like them. And then to have like that not be the issue anymore, right? If we're not all seeking desperately representation, like what would happen? How would we change our like need to cluster? I think it's always like an interesting thought path to go there. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing.
one thing that I really took from your response and reflection now, Ryn, was the phrase you talked about internal work, right? And being able to grapple with that. And I think that that is something that is so, near and dear to Buddhist practice and so near and dear to what we do to advance a world of greater equity. And so in thinking about that action, who will introduce for us to hit pause process. We've heard a lot of really wonderful stories, some very powerful reflections. So Joanne, could you introduce what we have for everyone to reflect on next?
Sure. If we can, I'm going to turn your attention now to our Jamboard and invite everyone to share what resonated with you, given what Traci and Ryn has talked about. What resonates with you, and what other questions do you have about abolition, and maybe how it applies to your life? Yes, thank you, Devin, for punching in that link. And if we can share the Jamboard on our shared screen now, perhaps. I know for me, what's really resonated with me that Ryn and Traci both touched on is just our desire to be seen and, truly seen as whole people, and how the system really isn't built for us to be seen that way. And for me, I know I haven't been seeing myself outside of that racialized identity lens. And I'm, what I've been working on is trying to discover who I am outside of that racialized identity. And, this conversation has really brought that up for me. I think we're going to page 4 now. Right. So I'm curious what you all have that resonates with this conversation. And what other questions do you have about abolition that you would like to know?
I know I've asked myself all of those questions many times. So I'm noticing, lots of really wonderful questions about how do we do this? How do we take on these really grand, bold, ambitious visions that we've been talking about? Joanne, did you have any observations or anything you want to share that among these posts?
Yeah, I'm just noticing some commonalities that has been brought up before, and then now again is, how does Buddhism inform us in the abolition work? And I just love this question of how can we introduce abolition to the temple and the sangha space, because it for me, my sangha has always been the refuge. It's my sanctuary, and it kind of like starts and ends there. It's kind of like the space where I feel safe to try out some of my more radical ideas. But that hasn't always been easy. So I'm really curious what everybody has to say about that. If we don't feel comfortable doing that, or do you feel comfortable doing that work in your with your sangha, and what has worked and what hasn't? Yeah, I also see a lot of common thread about, taking steps to do this work and bringing it into your workplace, which is very courageous. Communities, what does abolition look like in our lives and in our communities and the institutions? Well, that's a lot of spaces, isn't it? We've got our sangha space, we've got our communities, we got our workplace. We have our work cut out for us. One really big question for me is, what are we trying to abolish in order to gain that safety? And before we start thinking about, well, actually, I'm not sure, chicken or the egg, what are we abolishing and what is the future we're trying to create? For me, that's just a huge question that, I can't even answer for myself.
So if I may synthesize, there definitely are these questions about how do we enact this? How do we take on something that seems so insurmountable? How do we do this in our workplace? How do we do this in our families, in our sanghas, in our communities? How do we make this a fiber of what we do? What are we abolishing and what is it we want to create? And so I think that those kind of curiosities that I'm seeing here kind of leads me to another question that we have that kind of starts in a very specific way, but can lead to a much greater discussion that addresses a lot of these curiosities. And this question for Traci and Ryn is, let's again start it and ground it in the personal. How do you start to advance an abolitionist cause in your work, in your life, in your community?
Yeah, thanks, JP, so much for that question. I can go first this time. I think for me, this past year has been a really big year in trying to answer that question. At the start of the pandemic, I was preschool teaching, and it was just very stressful to be an infant teacher. You can't really social distance with a 7-month-old baby. And so that led me to wanting to get out of teaching. And I was kind of in between grad school programs, the ministerial program that I'm in now and the writing program that I did before. And so I was wondering, like, okay, what could I do? So I was at that point of like creative world building, right, for my own life. And so I was thinking, I was starting to do these meditation groups like virtually because people were starting to do Zoom and starting to like get more like acclimated to events on Zoom. And so meditating with people virtually, transitioning my temple sangha into a virtual sangha, really opened up my mind to like how I could more creatively sit with people and make meditation more accessible. And so I think for me, I had to like look at the way I'd been raised in meditation, which was very strict and kind of traditional with Zen, a little lighter with temple activities, and think like, what am I carrying forward and what do I need to like re-examine? What do I need to learn more about? And so for me, like on a very personal level, I just kind of blew up my structure of meditation. So I was raised with like a more, which is the way I was raised was wonderful too. And there's room for that practice, but I think it's not as accessible. And so doing like longer sits and not having much discussion and having folks really just kind of have to hang out for a few years before they're really like getting more information from teachers was the way I was raised. And so I didn't want to keep perpetuating that like hierarchy of I'm a teacher and students need to come to me, right? And they need to do their studently thing like, because I am a teacher. I think there's ways to break that down much more. And so for me, I changed the way that I sat with people. So I decided to like just see if it would work, making a free and sliding scale sort of structure or framework, and just trying to like be open to sitting with people in different contexts. I first started sitting with people through like a kind of not a nonprofit, but just a communal group that was helping just folks who were protesting. So I was getting burnt out by protesting last year. Being on the front lines a lot is really taxing and stressful on the body, brain, and just soul. And so I figured a lot of us were feeling that way, and we deserve to have different ways to connect to ease in our body. And so I shifted the way I was working to try and better bring ease. So for me, bringing abolition into that involved really not diving into a capitalist structure right away. So I could set it up where it is very like easy or like familiar to me to use like a framework that is just like, okay, you can sit with me for $100 an hour or $60 an hour, things like that. But I really wanted to just like try and trust my community and live in a way that was like really radically surrendering myself to those around me, because I think that is recognizing our need and our interdependence is a way to build abolition into our practices or workplaces, right? And so my need to sit with people is equal to their need to sit with me, right? I need that interaction as well. And I think that I should be able to like find a way to sustain us both. So some folks pay more than other folks. The way some folks pay more allowed some folks to pay nothing at all. And just, I don't know, it's been a learning curve. And I'm not like earning a whole ton of money all the time, but it doesn't really matter because it feels so like creative. Like I'm trying to really live in a community. Like, what if I have needs that are monetary that could be met by like trades or just being a good friend, right? Like if I need to stay somewhere for a week, that shouldn't depend on me having money or not. That should depend on me being in a community with people who care about me. And so I think that framework, challenging myself to really like live uncertainly in a way that feels different than the way we're always living uncertainly, brought me into bringing abolition into my work. It brought me into trying to explore different ways of connecting. I really like your Instagram handle and your practice, which is webs of well-being, Traci. It feels like just building those webs of well-being, right, in between each other. We're just kind of finding different ways to connect. And I think you don't have to, quit your job today to be an abolitionist, but there's some way that you can shift, right? There's some way that your body is asking you to expand, asking you to rest, and listening and being creative and playful in that, and building a community and being in community in a way that allows you to support that, and having the luxury of community like myself that allows me to support that, I think has been the kind of work abolition melt for me. But I'm very curious to hear Traci's answer as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Ryn. I resonate with just like the way that meditation practice has supported you in connecting with abolition or in connecting with community. And I guess like my response to this question is like, I think there's so many different ways. I think there's just like a multiplicity, and like we're getting to hear from Ryn one way that they're getting to move forward as an abolitionist and what brings deeper connection with community and people. And I guess at the center of it, it's like, how do we build those relationships that help us learn more? Whether it's about abolition or whether it's about like the experiences of people who aren't impacted by policing or surveillance or incarceration. Because I feel like that's been so transformative in my own life, is just getting organized or being in those kinds of connections with people. Because I feel like once we're in those relationships and the work is being led by directly impacted people, the question around like, what are we abolishing actually becomes really clear. Like we get to hear from those experiences about, like one of the organizations that I had the opportunity to build with and co-found is based in Los Angeles. And I see a lot of Asian American faces here. So I'll give a shout out to Asian Pacific Islander Reentry and Inclusion through Support and Empowerment, API Rise. It's this really amazing formerly incarcerated Asian Pacific Islander support group, which I think that the way that they're holding healing circles, or the way that they are creating space for their own stories and experiences is building like an alternative. It's building that kind of space that I think many of folks had needed, especially if as many of them were actually policed and incarcerated as youth. Like one person's experience that I'm thinking about, Duck, who's a friend and a co-founder, was in the passenger seat of a car. The driver had shot out a window. No one was hurt. The two of them were still tried and incarcerated, and Duck was sentenced to life. And when you begin to learn about those experiences, I think you realize like how cruel. Like, is that really what the prison system was intended for or meant for? How is that supposed to support these young people who are like 16 years old, refugees, or coming from refugee families? How is that really in service of their own healing? And I think in just learning about those cruelties, and thankfully Duck got out much sooner than life, but it's still 16 years lost, It's huge. It's huge during a formative time of life. But it also makes me think about a lot of the people that I got the chance to share a yoga practice with for 3 years at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, also an LA-based org working with formerly incarcerated people, who I think helped me learn about also my own relationship to the way that we can feel imprisoned in our bodies or in our thoughts. And I think that's where meditation or yoga or various body-based practices can be so liberating. because at the beginning of our circles and our groups, there would be like a space to reflect on what are we struggling with. Many of them were struggling with employment because of their records. So for anyone who's like wondering like, oh, well, they have to do their time. Once folks get out, a lot of people still struggle with employment. But there's all those internalized ideas about ourselves, that I think become so much more intensified once you're incarcerated. And whether or not you've been incarcerated, I know like from my own experience, it's like, yeah, like we can feel really, I think, imprisoned by our views of ourselves or what we feel shameful about or what we feel like is good or bad. And I saw a lot of folks who were, coming to this weekly group also, I think, living in such a free way or living in such a way of resistance is maybe what I mean, of like asserting their dignity and joining campaigns to like locally to try to have different like policing efforts minimized in their communities. So I feel like my plug here is to get organized. I think that there's a lot of opportunities out there. The work that we're doing at Vigilant Love and, the amazing people, I think folks are still on from BL here, but I want to give a shout out to the team, to everyone who's a part of our Services Not Surveillance campaign, because what we're looking at is how the Department of Homeland Security, which was founded and established after 9/11, like all of the different kinds of programs that have been established. And in my work in Vigilant Love and working with a lot of Muslim folks or folks who have had their own experiences of surveillance or the stories that we hear about Islamophobia and how it impacts the mental health spaces, it becomes so clear to me of like, oh yeah, like we need to abolish these countering violent extremism programs, or we need to make sure that more mental health providers are aware of these programs that exist so that they don't receive this funding that's really weaponizing therapists to watch their clients, to surveil their clients. That puts a lot of us who are, in therapy ourselves, our client documents are more at risk to be used by the state for different reasons. So there's just so much, I think, that you get the opportunity to learn and grow upon once we're in community or once we're just building those relationships. And we definitely have a lot of programs at Vigilant Love that if anyone wants to get more involved or learn more about, that I think you can get plugged in with whether it's our Services Not Surveillance campaign or we have an Unpacking Anti-Blackness series. I think like that, yeah, that would be one of the last things I would note is just learning more and being part of racial justice spaces or a lot of spaces that are centering justice and healing is a really, I think, incredible way to be building with each other, being lifelong learners, but answering more of these really important questions that I think were posed on the Jamboard.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think I thank you for sharing that, and I feel like the part I like resonate so much with is like the in proximity-ness to like all of the work starts with being in proximity with your community. And I think for me, like protesting, one of the like most beautiful things about like that shared anger release, grief release, like that real community experience of like being outside and protesting, if that's accessible to you. Sorry for the sirens, but if that's accessible to you, doing that, chanting with like your people next to you, who keeps us safe, we keep us safe, like that really feeling the spirit of like keeping each other safe and seeing like, my friends get disappeared, get hurt, get arrested, like just for defending themselves and for trying to protect their people and to just love and be present and show who they are, and having that be like, so I think that's like you can see like waves of people get radicalized in Chicago protests when they go real awry, because people see the reality of like what people are living every day, and like how carceral institutions affect the way we can move and be and even just exist on a street at a certain time of day. And so I think like incorporating, just like thinking about those things leads us to finding different ways to express that. And like the groups at Vigilant Love, like you get to really engage and express those desires to build.
You know, I always hesitate to be prescriptive about things, but I also like things that are easy to remember. And one consistent theme that I've been hearing across this conversation is kind of 3 C's of care, of community, and of creation. And one thing that I think is so meaningful, you know, trying to grapple with the questions posed on the Jamboard is, you know, it starts with ourselves. It starts with understanding ourselves, and it starts with educating ourselves, which I think, you know, is something that many of us are very privileged to do. So I really want to acknowledge another question, a set of questions that was posed on the Jamboard, which gets at the nexus of why we are here, the nexus of Buddhism, our practice, and abolition. It's my curiosity that I want to pose to our speakers is, on the one hand, you know, how does Buddhism ground yourself? One thing that I'm getting is that interdependence as practice is central to Buddhism and is central to abolition. But I'm curious, like how did the teachings ground what you do? And I feel that there's a great hunger among the audience to hear about how do we bring that to our temples, to our sanghas? How do we have those difficult conversations? And so I would love to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, I feel like there's probably so much to bounce off of each other, and I'm excited to hear your reflections, Ryn, and JP. I hope you weigh in too. But I don't know, I think that at the core, like the main values that I feel like I've gotten from Buddhism is compassion and wisdom. And I feel like that's really at the center, or that's really like just deeply embedded in abolition. And in thinking of like doing no harm, or of like the kindness, the compassion that we're seeking through abolishing these oppressive systems and creating this new one. And just really quickly, I want to give like a historical nod, and JP is a historian. And, you know, I was reading recently about how W.E.B. Du Bois had created the term around abolition democracy, and that in the abolition of slavery, it was done so only in the negative sense of abolishing slavery, but it wasn't in the positive sense of creating new democratic institutions, or creating new possibilities, or a culture or a society that was going to support the liberation of Black enslaved people. And I guess that's the thing is with Buddhism, I feel like it's always encouraging us to be thinking about like what do we all need, or what is truly compassionate, or how can we cause less harm and cause less suffering. Like it comes with us in life. We know there's birth, sickness, old age, and death, but how are these institutions really actually speeding up our illnesses, or incarcerated people's illnesses, or people, immigrants and refugees who are detained and who are trying to flee like horrific situations in their homelands, also because of, you know, the way their economy has been impacted by, you know, the United States. But like, how are all of these institutions really creating more death and distributing more trauma as well? So yeah, I'll pause there for now, and I would just like love to kind of hear from Ryn first before sharing anything else.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like Buddhism, wisdom and compassion being the core components, like really makes a lot of sense to me when I think about abolition. And even in thinking of like how Buddhism came to be, like with the Buddha, like absolving his ideas of the caste system, like that's a form of abolition in the birth of Buddhism, and then in how we practice it, and thinking of like things that connect all different sects of Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths are kind of across the board, and thinking of suffering and the end of suffering, like thinking of that as a truth, that we're all suffering and there's an end. That means the work of understanding those two things is figuring out the end, right? Is building the world that produces the end of suffering. And I think that's kind of where the texts lead me, in understanding interdependence, as JP noted earlier, like truly deeply, and trying to understand all the ways that I cannot exist without everybody here right now existing, right? The conditions that I was born in are directly linked and tied and bound and moving and evolving with the conditions you were born in. And we are evolving those conditions at all time. And in thinking of Buddhism, for me, often thinking of it as like a, not just a spiritual practice, but like an ethical exploration, and thinking of it as harm reduction, do no harm, as Tracy said, thinking of how to really build sanghas, be a sangha in any moment with the people around me. That means abolishing a lot of systems, because it's not possible right now to do that. It's not possible in the conditions we live in to really allow everybody to fully love and thrive. And I think in order to do so, and in order to like understand, for me, the heart of what a lot of the Buddha is saying, it's getting to that point. Like, how do you wash away your preconceptions? How do you let go of what you think you know? And how do you continually be in this moment right now? How do you accept the full context of who you are and how you are? And accepting that involves putting yourself into action, right? That's karma. Karma is action. It's like the literal translation. And so putting yourself in the context of everybody's karma, of everybody's like workings, I think for me leads to those abolitionist ideals coming to fruition. And I feel like, yeah, I'll stop here too, but being called an idealist, I think, is something often that happens, and making your ideas actuality, I think, is the practice there. I don't know what comes up to either of you.
Um, okay. I'm hearing a little bit of like feedback. I don't know if anybody else is. One thing that I was thinking about, like that I appreciate about you just shared, Ryn, is that like to I guess, you know, it's very easy for us to judge ourselves and each other. And when I think about whether it's like the police state or criminalizing anybody, or the death penalty or surveilling people, there's all these things that are like embedded in that, of like really, I think, believing that like there's something about those people, they must have deserved it if they're going to get that kind of punishment. Like they must have deserved that kind of punishment. And I feel like Buddhism, I guess what I have been reflecting on is like how challenging it can be to let go of that duality of like that there are good or bad people, to like really, like, what does it mean to see ourselves as we are, or to see people as they are? I think is it's just like a really core component that abolition is so committed to, because I think it's like abolition believes that all people are deserving of unconditional compassion, or there's like this recognition that Buddhism teaches us about like how precious we all are. And if we're to really believe in that, then I think we would realize that these systems of punishment and control are not the way. And also that where our state is now, like I think more people, someone will know this better about like how rapidly prisons have just reproduced since the 60s or even before. But just how much policing and surveillance has intensified, I think we'll be really surprised to realize like how extreme it is today in 2021. And even the concept of like, what is the middle path? I think we'll see like we are so far extreme when it comes to how much goes into the police state. So when we're talking about defunding the police, I think a lot of people may feel like, oh my gosh, like what will happen then? But there's that whole opportunity of like possibility of openness. There's that like, I think teaching of impermanence, like actually like things are supposed to change and maybe we're supposed to like find some equilibrium here. And maybe we've gone to such an extreme. And I think what organizers help us to realize, or, what, news coverage helps us to realize is how much suffering there is at the hands of police or at the hands of the war that we see. What is happening around the world, what is happening in Palestine. I think it's really encouraging us to reflect on like how must things change and what is the middle path and how could actually abolition, which could seem very extreme, how is that actually perhaps more of the middle path than I realized than before, because of the way that it's really seeking for more justice or more humanity or more connection by eradicating these institutions that oppress or harm or kill us or divide us in different ways.
Yeah, that really makes me think about like ego and like unpacking like our clinginess. A lot of the teachings like could be simplified and you could think just like, yeah, let me be nice to like my friend and like these two people that are nice to me. But like when we really think of like why we're angry a lot of the time in these like situations where police get called for no reasons, and why like what people who are in no danger, who are like threatening somebody's life basically by calling the police on them, like what is going through their mind. And a lot of the ways we feel we own things and the ways we so desperately try to keep what we own because the state is constantly taking it away, like the way we are conditioned to have to live so out of reach of our needs, produces these like desperate straits of ways to interact, and we don't have as many options. And I think in like thinking of what you're saying about like surveillance and like really like how much is so much more extreme than we imagine, like being a protester or being somebody who organizes like self-defense workshops and things like that really opens your world up to like, or it's one way to open your world up to like how much you're being watched and how careful you have to be, like just telling your friends what you're doing even while protesting, like that sort of thing. Surveillance culture becomes really important in just keeping your friends safe and not having like a record of things that could be extremist, like the way we view extreme gets to shift, or it has shifted. And so I think that's a really good point. Like the middle way is so much less scary than we would think it would be, because it feels so radical to want abolition and to want to see police states fall and to see imperialism not be propagated anymore, or not move forward anymore. But it's so much less radical than the ways we have like constructed to hold each other back. Like that is a way more elaborate, radical and like intricate process. And then one more thing that came up for me was thinking of earlier when you said, Traci, that we're missing the complexity in a lot of stories. I think digging into nuance is something that the teachings of Buddhism continually encourage. And so we're encouraged not to flatten our view of something, not to say this is good, this is bad, but to say why and what is it actually, over and over again until we really understand it, and to know we never have a perfect picture, so we could always keep going. And so I think that leads to that like continual learner mindset, and just like really being able to separate from the like momentum of all the things that feel unstoppable, right? We can take a pause and know, no, this is this wasn't always like this, right? We didn't always like this. That means there's always a different way to be, because things are always changing, which is one of the core teachings there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I also feel like when we think about these institutions, and we think about the three poisons, and if I'm not mistaken, they're like anger, greed, and delusion, right? That like in order for the military industrial complex or the prison industrial complex to exist, I feel like they're like such an embodiment of those three poisons. Like the way that we like anger, and underneath anger is like often a secondary emotion, and what's underneath that is often fear. And so like in order for us to be pushing or to be thinking that other people deserve incarceration or surveillance, or that they deserve the occupation that they do, there has to be like this anger there, and this greed, and also this delusion of who those folks really are, that they're actually not connected to us, or that there's no way that you could relate like them. I feel like it's imagining others in such a harsh view. And it's also, there's so many corporations who are profiting off of these industries, and that gets into the greed part as well. So yeah, I think that like for us to be reflecting on ourselves too, like if when we notice some resistance around thinking about, is abolition possible, or is that really extreme? Is abolition extreme? I feel like it's also really important for us to like reflect on like how anger, greed, and delusion maybe keep us from being able to imagine further, or to consider, to even be curious about it some more, so we can continue our learning about other possibilities, or other ways that we could be working towards justice in our society and our communities.
Yeah, I think listening to people that are different from us helps us like shed that delusion so much. I know from like doing so many different types of work, sex work, healing work, being in different contexts, there are a lot of different ways people view my body, and there are a lot of delusions that I've had to face and like figure out where they come from, right? We internalize the things around us, and then we have to ask where this feeling even comes from, right? A lot of people feel dysphoria who are trans, and so sometimes when I'm feeling bad for myself, I'm like, okay, what about me feels bad, or is it a narrative that I can let go of? And usually in letting go of that narrative, every time I like feel better about myself, I'm better to somebody around me in some different way, right? I have a more expansive perception towards me, and so I have a more expansive perception towards them. And I think that has helped me with delusion a lot, with greed, with hatred. Regrounding in like the actuality of care has like, it can reshift like your whole way of being, so that things flow a little less, I don't know, it doesn't have to be so technical, 1 2 3 4 these are the steps to be an abolitionist. It can be, how can I be in my body right now? How can I be in my presence right now fully? And like, what does that mean? What's around me? Now I have to recognize all of that in its presence fully. I think that for me like helps dilute the poisons within me.
I could try to say something to, bring things together, but it would sound so bad compared to all of the wisdom that we've got to witness here right now. Yes, hydrate. When you share all that goodness, you need to hydrate. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time, but I also want to give the audience one last opportunity to pose any questions that you'd want to learn a little bit more about from our speakers. Everyone has been wonderful in the Jamboard, but for this, go ahead and use the chat, because I feel there's been a lot of great emotions. There's been a lot of great observations. People are quoting the speakers in the chat. So why don't we just return to that? And our speakers, Traci and Ryn, you two can just monitor the chat and take on any questions that you feel you'd like to dig into.
That sounds great.
Thank you, Zora, for posing that question.
I think for me, reading Zora's question, thanks for submitting that. How can we best approach abolishing oppressive systems that may actually benefit us in one way or another? There are a lot of systems that we benefit from that are really hard to challenge because it's accepting that equality sometimes means giving things up, not just somebody else gets something, right? And that can be really scary. It can feel like a threat to our lives. It can feel like a threat to our livelihoods. And I think for me, like, when I'm feeling that way, decentering myself in that conversation, right? Say it's like a conversation about colorism, and I'm in a group of Black folks, and darker skinned Black folks are talking about their experiences and about how colorism affects our community. That's a system I benefit from, right? As a light skinned Black person, there are certain things that are easier for me than if I was darker skinned. That's true across the world. And so sometimes it feels, I know as a teen, like, or even now when I'm feeling insecure, but like really when I was first trying to think of this as a teen, like it felt like I was saying, like I was giving something up or something was like wrong with me to acknowledge colorism, because that meant maybe I'm a part of the problem. But that's okay to be in your full context and maybe be a part of the problem. Like seeing that, I think, is the first step. And so for me, just trying to name the ways that I might be benefiting from a system and the ways like it's perpetuating violence, like being in academia and being somebody who's had the fortune to go to grad school and have like grants pay for things like that. There are systems that I could not question. There are temple systems that I could not question trying to be a minister that would benefit me in making my path easier, right? There are ways looking like a traditionally masculine person can make my life easier, but trying to unpack how that is, the logic is affecting the way I think about things, I think is the first step for me. So like for colorism, like breaking down what that means for being a masculine person and sometimes getting like a perceived male privilege or things like that in different spaces. It doesn't matter that I'm not a boy, like sometimes that is how the world treats me. And so I don't have to give up any of who I am to understand that context, right? And to be more understanding of what it is to be femme in this world and what it is to not look traditionally masculine and have that experience when you walk through a door. And so that can lead me to better supporting people around me who are not benefiting from the system, right? If I can't just eradicate trans misogyny, all forms of misogyny, at least I cannot uphold it within my spheres. I can try to break it down when it comes up for me in different ways. So I think naming things, that's a long-winded answer, but naming things and just really not making it mean you're a bad person, but just that you've got more to learn and things to grow into. That's my answer.
I think we have time for another, if you want to respond, Tracy, and then we might need to wrap up for the night.
Yeah, I had a feeling as we were sitting in that moment of silence, like people are probably typing in really thoughtful questions into the chat, and it just exploded. But I guess my quick response to that question about like how can we best approach abolishing oppressive systems that may actually benefit us in one way or another. I think like in addition to everything that Ryn just shared is like, I guess my question is like, is that really true? Like, is that true that these oppressive systems do benefit us? And if they do, is that worth giving up? Like what Ryn was talking about, is there another way to have that need met in some other possible way? And I think that a lot of people who are in the work of, you know, abolition or transformative justice or in just social justice work in general, a lot of people in our Sangha, I feel like actually have like so many creative ideas of how to support each other. I think we saw that so much in mutual aid work happening over the pandemic, but like, is there another way that that need can be met that isn't through this institution? And then I see like a lot of questions about like concrete next steps. And I know that like folks in the YBE committee had put together like a resource guide, and I know Ryn and I had contributed to some of that. So hopefully like reading or listening to something I think is a tangible next step, like our own process of learning more. I feel like I need to do so much more learning, but I hope that folks heard my plug for like just getting involved of like with an organization, whether it be like our services not surveillance campaign work or just getting involved in any organization where you want to learn more about the issue that they're working on. If they're an abolitionist organization, you'll learn so much about like the intricate ways that we're really trying to do it. It's not just that we're saying, end this, you know, abolish the Department of Homeland Security. There's so much that goes into the organizing work. And I think I know for me in LA, there's so much that went into most recently, like Reimagine LA's campaign, or there was a Measure J on the last election ballot that had passed that is now redistributing a portion, I think it's like 10% of LA County's budget to like education or different, like a lot of different social services that benefit everyone. So yeah, hopefully getting involved in some sort of way. And then I think just reflecting for ourselves, like how is my discriminating mind, my monkey mind, just naturally judging others or judging myself and continuing to reify these unhelpful beliefs about myself or each other is maybe like the way that we can apply it for ourselves. So yeah, I wish we got more.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I want to thank both of you so much. I have learned immensely. You two need to take this on the road. I'll come to the next session, but I want to hand it over to Marissa, another member of our committee, who will close things out and leave you, all of you, with the resource guide that we helped create.
Yeah, thank you, JP. And again, thank you, Tracy and Eli, so much for sharing the space with us today. And I think everyone here really appreciates your vulnerability and the knowledge that you've shared. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming and participating in our event today. And then lastly, thank you to JP and for organizing, and then to Joanne for helping facilitate. And then as Tracy mentioned, Casey or someone on the tech team will be sending a page of resources for further reading and knowledge on abolition for y'all. And then last of all, if you would like to stay updated with YBE, you can find us on all of our socials, the Facebook, page, Instagram, and our Twitter by just looking up the Young Buddhist editorial. And then lastly, the Social Justice Committee, which JP is a part of, and who helped put on this event, we just released a statement on solidarity with Palestine. So if you would like to read it, it is on our website. And then if you want to subscribe to the YBE newsletter and stay updated with us, it's also on the website. And then if you're interested in learning more or about joining the Social Justice Committee, feel free to contact Casey or myself. I can drop my email in the chat, and then maybe Casey can drop hers as well. And yes, thank you for coming, everyone.